So, again, I'm Steve Stearns. I have chosen what I consider to be a tough subject for me because guess who writes these? Who I write these for? Me. Hopefully, my truth will be something that can benefit you. The title is The Power of Vulnerability. So, my talk today is Power of Vulnerability. So, I'm going to start off with Merriam-Webster's definition of vulnerable, which is capable of being physically and emotionally wounded. So at this point, I expect the many of you watching me or looking at me in the chapel are scratching your head and having this thought bubble above your head, what the heck is Steve going to try to tell us today? So I'm hoping you'll stick with me because there is a good point to that. If you would, give me a few minutes to try to explain that. But I am going to start off with some scripture that I'm going to revisit after the next story that I tell you in this lesson. It's from James 1:10. Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial. For when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him. So I'm going to tell you a little story about little Steve that happened very early in my life. Many of you have had, or I had, overprotective parents. Anybody in the room that sound familiar too? Yep. So I definitely did, and as a little kid, I mean really little kid, because I was physically smaller than all the dudes in my classes. And I'm not really sure why I was so small, because actually I popped out at 10 pounds, but somehow I wound up small, flexible, and compact. So this story is about the little Steve the gymnast that could have been. I decided because of my size that gymnastics sounded like a pretty good fit for me, and I joined a gymnastics class that I was really loved every single minute of it. About 2 or 3 months into it, I fell off the parallel bars and busted open my chin that required 5 stitches. You can still feel it, it's right there. And I was a bloody mess because from day one my blood has always been thin. So I looked a lot more tragic than it was. And so I did have an overprotective mom who, when she heard what had happened and actually saw all the blood over me, she immediately, with hands on hips, went to the gymnastics teacher and told him that I will be withdrawing from that class and they will never see me again. Did you notice that there was one person that she perhaps did not consult in that decision? That was me. But, you know, I'm going to apologize to overprotective parents. I'm not trashing you today, because when we're born, we can't feed ourselves, we can't walk around, we can't make decisions, and we're pretty helpless. So that's an easy habit to get in, and it's an awfully hard one to let go of. For the parents in the room, you'll recognize that. So I'm not dishing my mom, I love her to death. So let's suppose that maybe she had asked me if I wanted to return to that gymnastics class after that. What if little Steve had said yes? I'd like to go back and figure out what I did wrong so I can become better. What if little Steve's determination to get better, maybe send him in winning statewide contests in gymnastics, and then maybe some national gymnastics tests. Maybe he qualified for the Olympics and went. Then only to find out that he didn't make the podium. But that only made him more determined to return and to get better, and did in fact wind up at the Olympics and with the gold medal. That's an awfully big what if. But let me follow this with an even bigger what if. What if Simone Biles, arguably the greatest gymnast of all times, was training and fell off a piece of equipment and somebody pulled her from that? Imagine what she would have missed. And I would like to acknowledge that there's good, I have done that, reasons for parents to do what they did. But now, let's take a look at that scripture I read from James again. Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial. Think about the emotional pain and physical pain that what if little Steve would have felt. For he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life. Think abundant life, which God has promised to those who love him. What if every time you felt something emotional or physically painful, we just quit? I'm pretty sure that's not the correct path to abundant life. So now I want to talk about, here's a danger zone. Steve is mixing science and spirituality today, but there is a reason for that you'll notice at the end. How many of you have heard about the works of Brene Brown? Quite a few. One of my favorite authors. She's a Harvard-educated researcher who has a tendency to study human emotions, things like courage, vulnerability, shame, empathy, that kind of thing. She actually wrote a book with the same title as this lesson, The Power of Vulnerability. I only want to talk about the book, however, in terms of its basic conclusion. But more importantly, I want to talk about Brene Brown's reaction to her research that she expressed after it was published in some of her talks and after her book was already out and published. She concluded that some of the happiest people, this is from the book, concluded that some of the happiest people on the planet are those who had a great sense of belonging and love and felt worthy. So as any good researcher would do, she put all the happy folks in a big manila envelope and began to look at what traits they had in common. This is a quote from Brene. One thing that they all had in common was they fully embraced vulnerability. They believed that what made them vulnerable made them beautiful. They didn't talk about vulnerability being comfortable, nor did they talk about it being excruciating, as I, meaning Brene, heard in earlier shame interviewing. They just talked about it being necessary. They talked about the willingness to say, I love you first. They talked about the willingness to breathe through waiting for the doctor to call after a mammogram. Their willingness to invest in a relationship that may or may not work. They just thought this was fundamental. The other trait that they had was courage. And most agreed that that's simply a subset of vulnerability. Remember that so this part, when researcher Brene put that together, caused a bit of a breakdown for Brene, and that's what I really want to talk to you about today. Remember that I told you that she's a researcher, and what she could not believe was that she had pledged allegiance to research, where the job, as you know by definition, of research is to control and predict and to study phenomenon for the explicit reason to control and predict. So now her mission to control and predict turned up an answer that the way to live is with vulnerability and to stop controlling and predicting. This is what led what she refers to as her breakdown. So much so that she admits that she had to go to a therapist for a therapist. And this is where I want to ask Cynthia, do you have one of those? But Brene's therapist suggested to her that she didn't have a breakdown, but she did, in fact, have a spiritual awakening. Brene, after much thinking and rethinking, finally came to grips with this and admits that this caused her to make major changes in her life. To quote her once again, "I am just so grateful because to feel this vulnerable means I also feel alive." So back to vulnerability a little bit. Our friend Jesus has exhibited, in spite of the fact that he came into the world with divine in him and teaching us that we also had divine in us, had moments of vulnerability, and probably the best known one that many of you will think about is in the Garden of Gethsemane. He knew he was moments away from Judas Iscariot, and he knew his day was coming. The Garden of Gethsemane now became his holding cell and his death row. Feeling the weight of impending death, Jesus turns to his, what many call his inner circle of friends, which was Peter, James, and John. And he says, "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death." That's from Mark 14:34. A vulnerable Jesus confesses his soul's most deadly distress, and even more invites his best friends to come close and witness his intimate moments in prayer with God. He said, "Abba, Father, all things are possible through you. Remove this cup from me. If not what I will, but what you will." That's from Mark 14:36. So Jesus knew that his darkest hour, his vulnerability, would give him a spiritual connection to his friends that he loved and he trusted. Connections are something really, really important to me, and I can tell you that I have what I would also call spiritual connection with many of you in this room. So vulnerability gave him the courage he needed for that day, and his authenticity as a human and divine shined brightly for everyone else to see. So now that we've talked about courage a little bit, Charles Fillmore shared this in one of his writings. "True spiritual courage will lift us above every hindrance, even that of an accusing conscience that refuses to remit past sins and keeps us in a state of self-condemnation and remorse. True courage looks to God for the solution of every problem." Remember how Brené Brown concluded that courage is a subset of vulnerability? Folks who embrace their vulnerability also had courage, and remember how Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane that we just spoke about found that courage he needed in his darkest day through his vulnerability and his ability to connect in total trust with his friends Peter, James, and Paul. So I guess you can see how this talk about courage and vulnerability is simply the key to unlock And again, from Charles Fillmore, the true spiritual courage that will lift us above every hindrance. As Charles Fillmore reminded us, courage represents power in this lesson, and therefore the title, The Power of Vulnerability. So the question now, is everyone kind of up to speed and not afraid of Merriam-Webster's definition of vulnerability at this point? I don't think I'm perceiving that any of those thought bubbles about exiting the chapel are still here. So I think it's safe to move on and talk about some of the big vulnerability elephants in the room. And these are what I guess I would call fringe groups that still think it's impossible and unsafe to be vulnerable. I would admit that the possibility for pain in these fringe groups is way higher. But the consequences of being who you are have social and, most importantly, spiritual consequences that far outweigh the potential for pain. So in this Pride Month, I want to talk about one of those groups, the LGBTQ group, and therefore it's my opinion an excellent time for folks in this group to think about coming out as who you truly are. I'm not trained in that, but I'm absolutely certain that being who you are is your best path to find the divine in you. History shows that the LGBTQ population has endured an inordinate amount of pain and suffering, and it's becoming easier. However, it is becoming easier for folks in this category to come out because the way has been paved by some pretty important people. For example, our Secretary of Transportation has no problem talking about his husband. A trans woman is now the head of Health and Human Services as a cabinet position. I learned the other day that a trans woman is involved in the unity movement and now holds a leadership position. So here's a quote from researcher Renee Brown that might help, and it's about feelings. You can't just numb those hard feelings, vulnerability, grief, shame, disappointment, without also numbing our other good emotions. So when we numb those, we numb joy, we numb gratitude, we numb happiness, and then we are miserable and we're looking for our purpose and our meaning. In my opinion, you're making it nearly impossible to truly connect with the divine in you or those in that group because you are telling yourself that part of you is inferior, and that's simply not true. You're a child of God, and you are enough. I'll hit on one other category, which is not the only fringe groups, but we have time limitations today, and that is addiction. Admitting that you're an addict, whether in recovery or not, is probably in every addiction recovery group's requirements. Does this make you a bit vulnerable? Yeah, it does. But it opens you up to being wholly who you are meant to be. Reverend Dan was a prime example of admitting his addiction, which enabled him to fully connect in the divine in him. It also allowed us to see the authentic Reverend Dan. It also gave him courage needed to be our spiritual leader for 5 years. And for that, I am grateful. So I will stop at that, but acknowledge that there are other fringe groups that need to be guided to healthy relationships with vulnerability. Some folks on the edges of mainstream may in fact experience more of the pain because they may not look, they may not act, they may not sound or move differently, but they have one thing in common with the rest of the world. They are all children of God, and they are enough. Anyone is always welcome to come here to test drive their vulnerability. At Unity of Augusta, our value statement that I just read, Unity of Augusta is accepting, is affirming, committed, kind, practical, and welcoming. But we really don't want you to stop with your vulnerability journey with just us, but boldly show the world who you wholly are. So in summary, vulnerability invites connection. Connection is always a big thing with me. I worked at business networking groups and had friendships that I still get calls 10 years later after I left because we're connected. And folks, most importantly, folks will see the Christ in you. Vulnerability builds spiritual courage. Courage it takes to find that abundant life. Vulnerability equals authenticity. I can tell you if somebody walks into the room and I'm in the room and they walk in with bravado, it takes me about 30 seconds to see who they aren't. So that's important. And then finally, happy, loving folks view vulnerability as something fundamental in their everyday life. As I was writing this lesson, for some reason, Robert Frost's poem, The Road Not Taken, kept popping out and into my mind. Maybe it's because the road to vulnerability will make all the difference in your life. That's probably it. So I'd like to finish with reading his poem, The Road Not Taken. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler. Long I stood and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other as just as fair and having perhaps a better claim because it was grassy and wanted wear. Though as for the passing there, I had worn them really about the same. And both that morning equally lay, and leaves no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day. Yet knowing how way leads to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. Shall be telling this with a sigh somewhere, ages and ages hence, two roads diverged in the wood, and I took the one less traveled, and that has made all the difference. Thanks for this opportunity to share my truths, and that's all I have.